The Parthenon is finished. It stands on the Acropolis, gleaming white and new, its marble columns still sharp-edged, the paint on its friezes not yet faded by a single winter. Below it, the city hums with a confidence that no city on earth has ever quite earned the way Athens has earned it. The navy controls the Aegean, the treasury is full, the playwrights are working, the philosophers are arguing in the agora, and the arguments are ones that people will still be having 2,000 years later. Pericles has just given the speech that historians will call the greatest defense of democratic ideals ever recorded. He spoke of Athenian openness, Athenian power, Athenian superiority, not in the way that tyrants brag, but in the way that a man describes a thing he has built and knows it is good. The disease arrives the next summer. It will destroy everything Pericles built, not in years, in months. It is not the last time. Rome at the height of the Pax Romana, an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, 1 million people crowded into the capital alone, 2 centuries of peace. Something arrives on the roads and kills 5 million people. The Pax Romana ends. The decline begins. Then Justinian, emperor of Byzantium, weeks away from restoring the entire Roman world. North Africa taken, Italy reconquered, the final push for Spain almost ready. The plague arrives in Egypt on a grain ship. It reaches Constantinople within months. The Western Roman Empire is never restored. The ancient world ends and a different world begins. 3 civilizations, 3 peaks, the same mechanism, the things that made each one great. The trade routes, the crowded cities, the military campaigns moving men across continents were precisely the delivery system for what destroyed them. The more advanced the civilization, the faster and more completely it collapsed. History called each one a tragedy. Nobody called them a pattern. The first civilization to be destroyed by the pattern was also the one nobody expected to fall. No city-state, no empire, no kingdom in the Mediterranean world had ever produced what Athens produced in the decades surrounding its golden age. Philosophy as a discipline, tragedy and comedy as art forms, democratic governance as a functioning system rather than an aspiration. The Parthenon, completed 2 years earlier, was not just a temple, it was an architectural argument that human beings could produce perfection. Athens had done something that most civilizations only dream of. It had become the center of the known world, and it knew it. Pericles understood this. He had guided the city through decades of naval expansion, securing dominance over the Delian League, a confederation of Greek city-states that functioned, in practice, as an Athenian empire. The tribute flowed in. The navy was the finest fighting force on the water anywhere. When Sparta and its allies marched into Attica that summer, preparing to ravage the Athenian countryside as they had done before, Pericles made a decision that was militarily sophisticated and, in retrospect, catastrophic in a way he could not have understood. He ordered the population of the surrounding countryside to abandon their farms and retreat inside the walls of Athens. The logic was sound. Athens' long walls extended from the city to the port of Piraeus, creating a fortified corridor to the sea. The navy could supply the city indefinitely. Sparta could burn fields all summer and accomplish nothing, while Athens sat safe behind stone walls and waited them out. The strategy would deny Sparta any engagement on land, which Sparta could win, and turn the war into a naval conflict that Athens would dominate. It packed roughly 100,000 additional people into a city built for perhaps 50,000. The port of Piraeus became the most crowded harbor in the ancient world. People were sleeping in the streets, in the spaces between the long walls, in whatever shelter they could find. Sanitation collapsed under the density. The city became, without anyone intending it, a perfect environment for transmission. And Athens was connected to everything. Ships from Egypt, Libya, Persia, and every island in the Aegean moved through Piraeus constantly. That connectivity was the city's wealth. It was also the open door. The disease arrived at Piraeus first. Thucydides, Athenian general, future exile, and the most rigorous historian of the ancient world, contracted the plague and survived. His account in the history of the Peloponnesian War is the primary source for everything that follows, and it is worth pausing on why he wrote it the way he wrote it. He was not writing for posterity in a vague or general sense. He set down the symptoms, he wrote, so that if the disease should ever break out again, it might be recognized. He understood he was documenting something that had not been seen before, and he understood, with a clarity that is almost painful in retrospect, that the absence of a name for it did not mean it was gone. He describes what he saw with clinical precision that has no equal in ancient literature. Sudden, violent headache, inflammation of the eyes, the throat, the tongue, bleeding from the mouth, sneezing, coughing that progressed rapidly to retching, skin covered in small pustules and ulcers, fever so intense that victims stripped off every piece of clothing and threw themselves into wells and cisterns, desperate for cold water on their bodies. Most people died between the 7th and 9th day. The ones who survived into the 2nd week often lost fingers, toes, or eyesight. Some lost their memory. The disease progressed through the crowded city with a speed and completeness that no one had encountered before. The physicians who went to treat the sick died first, in greater numbers than anyone else, because they stood closest to the suffering. Thucydides records this detail. Precisely. It was as if the disease chose those who tried to help. The temples filled with the dying. The bodies piled up faster than families could bury them. People stopped observing funeral rites because there were too many dead, and because the people who would have performed those rites were themselves dying. What this did to a city built on civic religion and democratic participation cannot be overstated. Athens' strength was collective. Its governance required citizens to engage, to deliberate, to believe that the city was worth the effort of maintaining. Thucydides documents the collapse of that belief in terms that are not metaphorical. He describes a condition he calls anomia, lawlessness, but deeper than mere crime, a dissolution of the shared agreements that held the city together. People who expected to die tomorrow stopped observing any code that had a tomorrow as its foundation. The social fabric of the most sophisticated democracy in the ancient world began to unravel in real time, and Thucydides watched it happen from inside. The plague lasted 5 years, in 3 successive waves. It killed somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people. Estimates vary, but the demographic consequences were unambiguous. Pericles himself died in 429 BC, 1 year into the outbreak. The man who had built Athens at its peak, who had given the funeral oration celebrating Athenian excellence, who had designed the military strategy that created the conditions for the epidemic, died of the disease his own strategy had spread. Athens lost a quarter of its army. It lost a quarter of its population. It lost Pericles, and no one replaced him. The plague so weakened its military capacity that the Peloponnesian War, which Athens might have ended on favorable terms before the epidemic, dragged on for another 25 years and ended with Athenian defeat. The empire Athens had spent a generation building was gone. The golden age was over. The city continued to exist, but it never again occupied the position it had held in the summer before the disease arrived. Sparta, encamped outside the walls, noticed what was happening and withdrew, not out of mercy, out of fear. The disease was visible even from outside. The smoke from funeral pyres was visible from outside. Sparta left because the plague was a more effective army than anything they had brought. The walls that made Athens safe made it dense. The trade routes that made it wealthy brought the ship that carried the disease. The strategy that was militarily correct was the thing that killed it. Rome was next, and it made every single mistake Athens made without knowing Athens had made them. Stick around until the end and subscribe if this is your kind of history. The first mistake was the roads. The Pax Romana had lasted nearly 2 centuries. Historians mark it as the closest the ancient world ever came to sustained, organized peace across an enormous territory, and the numbers support the claim. The empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain to the edges of Mesopotamia in the east. Roman roads connected every major population center across 3 continents. Trade moved at a scale and speed that would not be equaled for over 1,000 years. The city of Rome itself held more than 1 million people, a concentration of humanity that would not exist again in Europe until the modern period. Grain arrived from Egypt. Silk arrived, indirectly, from China. Spices arrived from India. Every commodity on earth flowed through Roman trade networks, and so did everyone who carried those commodities. Marcus Aurelius governed all of this. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful man on earth, and he was also by an improbable coincidence of history, a philosopher of genuine depth and humility. His private notebooks, what we call the Meditations, were never meant to be read by anyone else. They describe a man genuinely wrestling with how to be good while holding absolute power. He had no illusions about what the empire was. He had no illusions about his own mortality. What he could not have been prepared for was the scale of what was about to arrive. Roman legions returning from a campaign in Parthia in 165 AD brought something back with them that no military manual had prepared anyone to face. The precise origin of the Antonine Plague remains debated. Some sources trace it to Seleucia, the great city on the Tigris that the legions sacked during the campaign. Whatever its origin, it moved west along the same Roman roads that had made the empire function. The roads that connected Scotland to Mesopotamia connected the Eastern legions to the heart of Rome in weeks. The infrastructure of empire was the highway. What Galen walked through in Rome in the first months of the outbreak was a city that had no framework for what was happening to it. Rome had survived wars, political assassinations, fires that destroyed entire districts, food shortages that lasted seasons. Its population of over 1 million people had developed, over centuries, a particular kind of urban resilience, the ability to absorb catastrophe and continue functioning. The epidemic broke that. The forums where Romans conducted business began emptying. The baths, which had been the daily social institution of every class, the place where Roman civic life actually happened, closed because the men who operated them were sick, and because the water that had always been a pleasure was now, correctly or not, suspected of spreading death. The streets that had never been quiet in 2 centuries of empire went quiet. The city that had organized the known world could not organize a response to something it had never encountered and had no name for. Galen of Pergamon, physician to emperors and the most prolific medical writer in the ancient world, documented what he witnessed in Rome as the disease spread through the city. His accounts are the primary source for what the Antonine Plague looked like and how it moved, and his presence in Rome during the outbreak makes him the ground-level witness to everything that follows. He describes the characteristic symptoms with the precision of a man who understood anatomy better than anyone alive. Fever, violent diarrhea, vomiting, a pustular skin eruption that appeared after several days of systemic illness. Modern analysis of his descriptions points strongly towards smallpox. The pustular eruption is specifically consistent with variola, and the pattern of progression he documents matches what we now know of smallpox's disease course. This matters because smallpox in a population with no prior exposure is catastrophic. There was no immunity in Rome. There was no immunity anywhere in the Western Mediterranean world. The disease moved through populations that had never encountered it, which meant it moved through them with maximum lethality. He watched patients die. He documented the specific sequence, the fever, the gastrointestinal collapse, then the eruption on the skin, which he understood as the disease attempting to exit the body, a framework that was medically incorrect, but shows how carefully he was observing. He also noticed who survived and tried to understand why. His medical response was the most sophisticated possible, given the knowledge available, and it accomplished very little. He could treat symptoms. He could not interrupt the transmission. Nobody could, because nobody understood transmission. Galen left Rome. This is the detail his later critics used against him, that the empire's greatest physician, confronted with the epidemic he could not treat, chose to depart for his home in Pergamon rather than remain. He returned eventually, summoned back by Marcus Aurelius himself to serve the imperial household. But the departure is significant, not as a moral failure, but as a measure of what the epidemic actually looked like from inside it. Galen was the most knowledgeable physician alive. He had access to every resource the empire could provide. He watched what the disease did to the people he treated, and he left. The thing that drove the most capable doctor in the world out of the city was not ignorance. It was the specific knowledge of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. The legions were the primary vector. Rome's military machine, which had built the empire, became the delivery mechanism. Soldiers moved constantly, between campaigns, between provinces, between garrison posts. The plague traveled with them. It reached Syria, it reached Egypt, it reached the Rhine frontier and the Danube frontier. where the legions were stationed. Entire garrisons were devastated. At certain points, up to a third of the soldiers in some Roman military units were dead or incapacitated. The army that had held the empire's borders for 2 centuries could no longer fully hold them. Marcus Aurelius responded to the military crisis by doing something that would have been unthinkable to earlier emperors. He began recruiting barbarian soldiers to fill the legionary gaps. The practice was not new, but the scale was. For the first time, the Roman army was being rebuilt with men who were not Roman, who had not grown up inside Roman institutions, who did not share the accumulated culture of the legions. It was a necessary pragmatic response to an impossible situation. It was also the beginning of something that would not fully manifest until 3 centuries later, when the empire those men were defending no longer existed. The plague lasted 15 years, with a second wave striking in 189 AD. The total death toll across the empire reached an estimated 5 million people. Some accounts suggest higher. Whole provinces were depopulated. Agricultural land went unworked because the people who worked it were dead. Tax revenues collapsed because the population that generated them had collapsed. The economic logic of empire, which required continuous productivity from an enormous living workforce, began to break down. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD during a military campaign on the Danube, attending to the borders that his plague-decimated army was struggling to hold. He is the only Roman emperor whose death from the Antonine Plague is definitively documented by contemporary sources. The philosopher king, who had written about equanimity in the face of mortality, died of the epidemic that had consumed most of his reign. His son Commodus succeeded him, and whatever stability the Pax Romana had maintained began, visibly and quickly, to erode. The Pax Romana had effectively ended, not because an enemy crossed a border, because something arrived on the roads Rome had built to last forever. And somewhere to the east, in a Constantinople that had not yet been built, a man would spend his entire reign trying to restore what the plague had ended. And the plague would be waiting for him too. Justinian had almost done it. The timing is the thing. The gap between triumph and catastrophe is so precise, so narrow, that it reads less like history and more like something designed to make a point. By 541 AD, the Emperor of Byzantium, the eastern remnant of Rome that had survived the Western Empire's collapse, had accomplished what no one since the fall of Rome had dared attempt seriously. His general Belisarius had reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533, Italy from the Ostrogoths between 535 and 540. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, stood in Constantinople as a declaration that this empire was not merely surviving, but transcending what had come before it. Justinian controlled the Western Mediterranean for the first time in a century. The final campaign, Spain, Gaul, the complete restoration of Rome's old borders, was being planned. He was weeks, perhaps months, from launching it. Then grain ships from Ethiopia arrived in Alexandria. The plague that historians now call the Plague of Justinian, and that modern genetic analysis has identified as Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death 8 centuries later, moved from Egypt to Constantinople in months. The same sea lanes that delivered grain to the capital delivered the disease. The Byzantine Empire's control of Mediterranean trade routes was its greatest achievement and its most efficient vulnerability. Every ship that arrived at Constantinople's harbours, the greatest trading hub in the Mediterranean world, was a potential carrier. Procopius of Caesarea, historian and legal advisor who had served under Belisarius during the Reconquest campaigns, witnessed the plague's destruction of Constantinople firsthand and left the most detailed account of its effects on any ancient or early medieval city. His descriptions are not clinical, as Thucydides were, or medically analytical, as Galen's were. They are the observations of a man who watched an enormous, functioning, brilliant city come apart at the foundations in a matter of weeks, and who understood well enough to know that what he was watching mattered beyond the immediate horror. He describes the streets emptying, the markets closed, the bureaucracy ceased to function. Constantinople had been, days before the plague's peak, one of the most sophisticated administrative cities in the world, a city that ran daily on hundreds of interlocking systems of governance, commerce, and supply. Procopius watched all of it stop, simply because the people who operated those systems were dying or fleeing or locked behind their doors waiting to die. What he walked through in those weeks was a city that had stopped making noise. Constantinople was one of the loudest places on earth, the constant sound of a harbour city operating at full capacity. The markets, the arguments, the bells of the Hagia Sophia, the movement of horses and carts through streets that never fully emptied even at midnight. Procopius describes the silence that replaced it as the thing that frightened him most. Not the bodies, though the bodies were everywhere. Not the smell, though the smell of the dead reached the harbour before any arriving ship could see the walls. The silence. A city that had been the administrative centre of the Mediterranean world, that had run on the accumulated energy of 500,000 people operating in close proximity, had simply gone quiet. The only sounds were the carts moving through the streets removing the dead, and the occasional voice of someone calling for a family member who did not answer. He records the death toll at 5,000 per day at the height of the outbreak. Some accounts, Procopius himself in certain passages, put it at 10,000 per day. Even if those numbers are exaggerated, even if the true figure was half that, the implications are staggering. Constantinople at this period held perhaps 500,000 people. At 5,000 deaths per day, the city was losing 1% of its population every 48 hours. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Justinian eventually ordered mass graves, and then ordered soldiers and officials to dispose of the bodies however they could. Procopius describes towers on the walls of the city used as mass burial sites, bodies thrown in and compressed down to make room for more. The smell of the dead reached the ships arriving in the harbour before they could see the city. Justinian himself contracted the disease. He survived, which was either fortunate or merely extended the suffering, depending on how one reads the decades that followed. But while he lay bedridden in his palace, the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean world, reduced to a man expected to die, unable to govern, unable to direct the military campaigns that were his life's work, the empire did not stop needing to function. The campaigns in Italy stalled. Belisarius, who had achieved the impossible reconquest, found himself without supplies, without reinforcements, without the administrative support he needed. The soldiers who had taken Italy were dying of plague or were immobilized. The momentum of reconquest, which had been building for 15 years, simply stopped. It never restarted. What distinguishes the plague of Justinian from the other two is not scale. Athens lost its empire and its golden age. Rome lost the Pax Romana and began a long, slow degradation. Justinian lost the specific, narrow, almost achieved thing he had spent his entire reign building toward. The plague did not merely weaken Byzantine civilization. It arrived at the precise moment of maximum leverage and removed the force at the exact instant it was most needed. The Western Roman Empire was not restored. The ancient world, which had been in intermittent crisis for a century, but was showing, under Justinian, genuine signs of reconstitution, ended. The medieval period did not emerge from decline. It emerged from the specific, datable, documented moment when the plague made reconstitution impossible. The plague recurred in waves until approximately 750 AD. Each wave further reduced the Byzantine tax base, the military population, the agricultural workforce. Estimates for the total death toll range from 25 to 50 million people across the Mediterranean world over those 2 centuries. Some analyses suggest that the Byzantine Empire lost half its population before the waves finally subsided. Into the vacuum left by those waves, history accelerated. Islam emerged in Arabia in the early 7th century, a century after the first wave, and the armies of the early Islamic caliphates moved rapidly across territories that had been Byzantine and Persian for centuries. The Byzantine Empire could not hold what it had held before. Persia, which had suffered equally from the epidemic, collapsed almost entirely. The religious and political map of the Mediterranean world was redrawn within a single century, not because of any military genius on either side, but because the plague had cleared the ground. Justinian died in 565 AD, 24 years after the first wave. He had outlived the immediate crisis. He had not outlived the consequences. The campaigns in Spain that he had planned in 541 were abandoned. Italy, reconquered at enormous cost, was invaded again by the Lombards in 568, 3 years after his death, and was never fully reclaimed. He died knowing that the project of his reign was undone, not by an enemy army, not by political failure, not by his own choices, but by something that had arrived on a grain ship from Ethiopia. Procopius had watched him make the decisions, had ridden with Belisarius through the reconquered territories, had seen what the empire could have been and documented what it became instead. He set it all down, the victories and the catastrophe, with a precision that allowed later historians to reconstruct not just what happened, but the exact gap between what almost happened and what actually did. 3 times the pattern had run, 3 times the same mechanism. Nobody who lived through any of it understood what they were living through. And that is the most important part of what comes next. 3 cities, 3 peaks, 3 collapses. The argument is not that these civilizations were unlucky. The argument is that they were exactly as lucky as civilizations get, which is to say, they were unlucky in the specific way that success makes inevitable. Every achievement that Athens accumulated, every road Rome built, every sea lane Justinian controlled, was simultaneously a piece of the mechanism that destroyed them. The things that made them great were the delivery system for what killed them. That is not a rhetorical observation. It is a structural one. Athens packed its population behind walls to protect it from Sparta and created a petri dish. Rome built roads that connected every corner of the known world and built a highway for the plague traveling west from Parthia. Justinian controlled every major sea lane in the Mediterranean, which meant every grain ship from Egypt reached Constantinople in days, and the disease those ships carried reached it with them. The more sophisticated the civilization, the more complete its connectivity, the faster and more thoroughly it could be unmade. The lesson requires accepting something that no civilization has been willing to accept, that the things built in order to survive are the same things that make catastrophic death more efficient. Consider what has happened since. The Black Death arrives in 1347 on Genoese trading ships at the port of Messina in Sicily, the same Mediterranean trade network that had been delivering goods and diseases since the Athenians built their fleet. It originated in Central Asia and traveled west along the Silk Road trading, routes before reaching Crimea, where Genoese merchants loaded it onto ships without knowing what they were carrying. The most connected port city in medieval Europe received it first, then the next most connected, then the next. The Black Death followed the map of European commerce like a precise inventory of who traded with whom and how often. It kills between 30 and 60% of Europe's population within 5 years. The most commercially sophisticated civilization in medieval Europe, the Italian city-states, with their banking networks and trade routes reaching from England to the Levant, suffers the worst losses. Florence loses half its population. Venice loses 3 in every 5 people. The cities that had built the most sophisticated trade infrastructure in the medieval world paid for that sophistication in the most direct way possible. The network was the exposure. The achievement was the vulnerability. Athens would have recognized every detail of it. Then, the Columbian Exchange, the exposure of the indigenous peoples of the Americas to European pathogens for which they had no immunity. The populations of the great civilizations of the Americas, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, the complex chiefdoms of North America, were at their peak of development, at their heights of organization and cultural complexity, when European contact arrived. Smallpox moved through the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan faster than Cortez's army did. By some estimates, 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of contact, not primarily from warfare, but from disease. Both of those things were true simultaneously. The conquest was a military campaign and a biological event, and the biological event was the larger catastrophe by orders of magnitude. Then COVID-19, the most globally connected civilization in human history. Supply chains running from every continent to every other continent, passenger aviation moving, millions of people between cities every day, a connectivity that would have looked like magic to Thucydides and like a perfect vector to anyone who had studied what he wrote. A novel pathogen emerged in one city, in one country, and within weeks it was on every continent. Within months, it had killed more people than most wars. The pattern did not change. The scale changed. the mechanism was the same. A disease that in 430 BC would have reached 3 cities in a year, reached every country on Earth in 3 months. Thucydides wrote that he set down the symptoms so future generations might recognize the disease if it came again. Future generations built airports. The long-term consequences of the ancient plagues were not merely demographic, they were civilizational in the fullest sense. They changed what kinds of societies were possible afterward. Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, which the plague made inevitable, ended the specific experiment of Athenian democracy as a dominant force in Greek politics. What followed was not worse by every measure, but it was different in fundamental ways. The independent polis gave way eventually to Macedonian hegemony and then to Rome. The collapse of the Pax Romana under the pressure of the Antonine Plague and its consequences set in motion the military, economic, and administrative changes that would, over 3 centuries, transform the empire into something its founders would not recognize. The forced recruitment of barbarian soldiers, begun under Marcus Aurelius as an emergency measure, became a permanent feature of late Roman military life, and ultimately, the mechanism of the empire's political dissolution. The plague of Justinian did not merely end an emperor's project, it ended the possibility of the ancient world resuming. The medieval period was not a failure of civilization to maintain itself. It was what civilization looked like after the trade networks collapsed, after the cities depopulated, after the administrative machinery of a connected world ceased to function. It was humans rebuilding from a lower base. The historical consequences of disease are consistently underweighted. Military history gets the monuments and the commemorations. The battles of the ancient world have named generals and tactical analyses and maps. The plagues get footnotes or chapters near the back of books about the civilizations they destroyed. This is partly a question of narrative legibility. A plague has no hero, no villain, no moment of decision that changes everything. It is diffuse. It is everywhere at once. It does not march. But the shaping force it exerted on history was greater than most of the battles that get the monuments. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in those private notebooks, about the transience of all things, the way empires and individuals alike were subject to forces larger than any human will. He was a philosopher who understood impermanence and a ruler who was destroying himself, trying to hold permanence in place. He did not know that the disease spreading through his army was the thing that would prove him right. He was a wise man living inside the evidence for his own philosophy, and he could not see it. Justinian could not see it either. Procopius could see it afterward, which is the historian's particular form of vision, clear about the past, unable to help with the present. And Thucydides, who understood more about what he was watching than almost anyone who came before him, set down the symptoms so that future generations might recognize the disease if it came again. He described what it looked like, how it moved, what it did to the body and then to the city. He wrote it down specifically because he knew the absence of a name did not make a thing absent. It came again. The warning was there, written down, preserved, translated, studied in universities across the world for 2,000 years. And again, Athens at its peak, the Parthenon, gleaming, the funeral orations still echoing in the agora, the city of philosophers and playwrights and democrats, at the absolute height of what human civilization had ever produced. The disease arrived the next summer. He described what it was like and set down the symptoms, knowledge of which would enable it to be recognized if it should ever break out again. It broke out again, and again. It has not stopped. Is this a pattern that can be broken? Every civilization that reached the height of maximum connectivity paid the same price. The prices have not gotten smaller as the civilizations have gotten larger. We have vaccines and epidemiological surveillance and antiviral medications that Thucydides could not have imagined. The question is whether those tools are sufficient to interrupt the mechanism, or whether they are the new version of Pericles' walls, sophisticated and rational, and containing their own flaw that nobody has identified yet. Think about the grain ships arriving in Alexandria in 541 AD. Justinian depended on them. There was no version of his empire that could have existed without that trade. Is there a version of modern civilization that exists without the reach that makes the next pandemic faster than any that came before it? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this.